Before we begin, I should let you know that I'm on a soccer field. My son has goalkeeping practice, which makes it sound like we are going against the martial law. But anyway. So last time we talked about Richard II's notion of divinity and kingship. And then we talked about the conflict between Mowbray and Bolingbroke over the assassination of Gloucester. Shakespeare's audience would have been aware of Mowbray's guilt and Richard's guilt because of that previous play we had told you about, Woodstock. But they also would know that Henry Bolingbroke would become the king. He would seize the throne. The audience would know this entirely. So even if Bolingbroke feels that he's not, or he feels that he was just, what's important about Richard II is that it seems that Henry is unaware of his own treasonous thoughts. And this is what makes so interesting when Bolingbroke asks Mowbray to confess both politically and spiritually before they enter into their exile. And he seems very sincere.
Norfolk, so far as to mine enemy. By this time, had the king permitted us, one of our souls had wandered in the air, banished this frail sepulture of our flesh. As now our flesh is banished from this land, confess thy treasons ere thou fly this realm. Since thou hast far to go, bear not along the clogging burden of a guilty soul.
Now, this is where Mowbray responds, and it's almost a prophetic warning.
No, Bolingbroke. If ever I were a traitor, my name be blotted from the book of life, and I from heaven banished, as from hence. But what thou art, heaven thou and I do know, and all too soon, I fear, the king shall rue.
Think of Hamlet in his books, right? So what is astonishing about Richard II is that Henry is like the sinners in the Gospels during the crucifixion. It seems he knows not what they do. And Bolingbroke likewise is blind to his own ambitions. Of all the books and plays and movies you've ever seen about usurpations and coups d'etats, this one is the most ambiguous. It's completely the opposite of Julius Caesar. When does Henry decide to be king? I've never understood how it happens. I mean, we understand it happens, but textually, how does that come about? Do you remember the scene where Richard II is with his flatterers, Bush, Green, and Bagot? You know, the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of the text. And he's also with his cousin, the Duke of Omero. That's York's son, one of the last surviving sons of John of Gaunt. Remember the vials and the sacred blood. So Richard is being snarky about Henry Bolingbroke's popularity as he heads off to exile.
Richard. Ourself and Bushy here, Bagot and Green, observed his courtship to the common people. How he did seem to dive into their hearts with humble and familiar courtesy.
And of course, we know all this will be true. By the end of the play, Richard II's contract with the people, the commons, those non-nobles in the House of Parliament, and remember, the House of Parliament is where Richard will be deposed, the commons that he despises, it will revert to Henry in the ending. And Henry, by the way, is very conscious of his place in England as when he leaves.
Bolingbroke. Then England's ground farewell, sweet soil adieu. My mother and my nurse which bears me yet, where'er I wander, boast of this I can, though banished, yet a true-born Englishman.
Dittos. John of Gaunt when he thinks of England and fears civil wars. He's talking about Richard II's taxation policies.
Gaunt. Light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means soon preys upon itself. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection in the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier hands. This blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous for their birth, renowned for their deeds, is far from home.
And then,
Gaunt continued, England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself.
those are ominous warnings of what's to come. But what about Richard? What are his ties? His England is tied to his divinely sanctioned rule. We see this when he arrives at shore from Ireland to fight Henry, and finds the Welsh army he needed to help him reclaim England are gone. And of course, it's based on rumors that he's dead.
Richard, needs must I like it well. I weep for joy to stand upon my kingdom once again. Dear earth, I do salute thee with my hand, though rebels wound thee with their horses' hooves. As a long-parted mother with her child plays fondly with her tears and smiles in meeting, so weeping, smiling greet I thee, my earth, and do thee favor with my royal hands.
There's a strong contrast between these visions of England. Henry's is democratic, or at least tied to the idea of democracy. His are tied to notions of democracy, or at least tied to the ideas of the commons, that is the people. That is, the people must have some say in the ruling of England. John of Gaunt's is exceptional, like our own views of America, an ideological image of an island safe from conflict or disease or pestilence, right? Beyond its geographical borders. It's traditional and it's good. And Richard's, his land is paternalistic, it's familiar, and it's rooted to his right of being a king. Where Henry and John of Gaunt's vision are nationalistic, England, his is personal. My kingdom, he says. We can't look at Richard cynically in that way. He believes instinctively and intimately in the divine position of his king.
Richard. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, heaven for his Richard hath in heavenly play a glorious angel. Then if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right.
But is that true? It's almost sad how he calls upon the earth to help defeat his enemy. It reminds me of Hamlet's description of his father's ability to move the stones.
Richard, feed not thy sovereign's foe, my gentle earth, nor with thy sweets comfort his ravenous sense.
He doesn't understand himself as ravenous, greedy, like John of Gaunt does. He sees Henry as such, desirous of a rule that is not sanctified. And he's aware of Henry's desire to usurp him or unnaturally overthrow him. So, like in Midsummer's Night Dream or Romeo and Juliet's Queen Mab, he calls upon nature. But it's less the nature of England than the nature of his kingdom, to guard against Henry even from within. And that way he's not too far off from John of Gaunt's vision of England with its natural border, the coast. Again.
Richard, feed not thy sovereign's foe, my gentle earth, nor with thy sweets comfort his ravenous sense. But let thy spiders that suck up thy venom and heavy-gated toads lie in their way, doing annoyance to the treacherous feet, which with usurping steps do trample thee. Yield stinging nettles to mine enemies, and when they from thy bosom pluck a flower, guard it, I pray thee, with a lurking adder, whose double tongue may with a mortal touch throw death upon thy sovereign's enemies.
He's now, but are they nuts? Are you nuts? They don't know what he's thinking. They know their kingdom is crumbling.
Richard, mock not my senseless conjuration, lords. This earth shall have a feeling, and these stones prove armed soldiers, ere her native king shall falter under foul, rebellious arms.
He can only offer them God's protection in ways similar to John of Gaunt's solution to Gloucester's widow. Do you remember that?
Richard, not all the water in the rough-rude sea can wash the balm from an anointed king.
It's not possible. That sea is John of Gaunt's protective sea, England's wall or moat. That's on Scene 2, Act 1, 47 to 8. As well as John of Gaunt's triumphant sea, found at 2.1.61. It's sort of it's kind of a protection against Neptune's envious siege, 2.1.62. The sea is an ambiguous metaphor here. What's recognizable is that heaven will mediate this dispute. He compares heaven's gaze to the sun, and how the guilty, thinking they are unseen, will do bad things until suddenly become aware of their own sins and see themselves for who they are. He's confident that they will become self-aware.
Richard, discomfortable cousin, knowest thou not that when the searching eye of heaven is hid behind the globe that lights the lower world, then thieves and robbers range abroad unseen, in murders and in outrage bloody here? But when from under this terrestrial bowl he fires the proud tops of the eastern pines, and darts his lightning through every guilty hole, then murders, treason, and detested sins, the cloak of night being plucked from off their backs, stand bare and naked, trembling at themselves. So when this thief, this traitor Bolingbroke, who all this while hath revelled in the night, shall see us rising in our throne, the East, his treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but self-affrighted, tremble at his sin.
We hope for that too. The reason why there was all those gun lines we saw in California is because people are not confident. But we hope that the sun brings calm. But Henry, as I said before, he doesn't know who he is. That's Mowbray's charge, isn't it? So how does it all begin? This is what we're going to try to figure out in the next episode. How does Richard lose his throne?
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.